All right, everybody, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back. Welcome back to class 308. It is the eighth week of school. So we are right at the halfway point. And as all of you, I'm sure, are very, very intimately aware of, the spring break begins next week. So you'll have that break, which I've mentioned already. There's an opportunity for you to really get things like stabilized, either catch up, get ahead, whatever. It'll make the last 7, 8 weeks of class a lot more comfortable for you. And I say that because, of course, one of those weeks is finals, so everything gets kind of wonky towards that time. So there's a very clear trajectory to the end at this point. So I hope all of you are really committed to just getting the best experience you can out of this whole semester, walking away with some really solid, good grades, feeling good about what you've accomplished, going into a 3-month break where you will not harbor any regret, you will not feel bad about what you've done, you feel great about it, and it'll really enhance that free time and your ability to then just think through, where you are in your life relative to your education and everything else, and maybe just clearly sort of establish a path forward for yourself in your life during this summer break. Feeling good about having, conquered some of these more difficult courses that maybe you've been kind of intimidated by. So make sure you make the best of this experience. It's going to be a good thing for you overall, no matter how you look at it. So regardless of how hard it gets right now, always remember that it will be worth it to you. The amount of time you put in, the amount of pressure and stress you have to endure will be worth it. So just stay in the moment, focus on what you're doing, do your best job on what you're doing, and everything else will fall into place if you take that approach. Are there any questions about anything in particular you'd like me to address before I move into the material today? All right. So again, this is the second part of the course. So we established the in chapter 5 we established sort of the basic framework that we use to analyze optimal decision making by firms in a variety of competitive contexts that they might operate in. So that has its own set of complexities. We had short run, we had long run conditions for the firms picking their optimal choices of their inputs into production that will minimize their costs and therefore maximize their profits, because that's what it's all about. Lowering costs, increasing revenue so profits can be at their maximum, which ultimately reflects the value of a firm. It's how firms are priced in markets. They're priced based on their present discounted value of their future income streams. So these things are all relevant and important. So we did that, and we're gonna use that today, actually. But beyond that, we did chapter 6, which just dealt with some issues some practical issues on how to go about procuring inputs in the least costly manner, and then a couple of issues related to the principal agent problem. So make sure you're aware of the terminology in that chapter and some of the issues that I covered in my lecture. Chapter 7 had to do with the nature of industry. We'll cap it off today. We essentially finished the chapter already, but today it'll just sort of, the last part kind of introduces the four competitive, the four contexts that a firm can operate in, that we do study and have models for, which is perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. So I'll just briefly go over their characteristics at the beginning of class today, and that'll kind of set the path forward for the rest of the course. So we'll start on perfect competition today, which deals with, chapter 8 deals with managing in perfectly competitive industries, monopoly industries, and then monopolistically competitive markets, which I'll talk about the distinction between as soon as we get going with the actual material. So this is the final chapter of the second part of the course. We'll cover some of perfect competition today, finish that off on Thursday, jump into monopoly, on Thursday, and then we're going to have our break. So that's the opportunity for you to kind of go back, start preparing for the second exam, and then when we get back, I haven't decided yet. I think that first Tuesday of spring break, I left myself an out because I have to take a day off in April, and so I need to skip 2 sessions of this class. And so I think I'm going to leave one. I think I'm going to leave that first Tuesday as off for this class. When we get back, we won't meet that first Tuesday morning. We'll just meet on Thursday, and that'll finish off the second part of the course, and then that'll allow you to have yet another weekend to prepare for the exam, which will be the following Tuesday. So rather than just kind of try to push it all in and kind of finish it off on Tuesday and then have the exam on Thursday, I thought this would be better. So this is what we're going to do. So let's just say now it's solidified that first Tuesday, post spring break, we will not be meeting, and I'll remind you of it, of course, via emails, and even right before I'll remind you, just so you remember. But just to keep in mind, like, we are heading basically towards the end of the second part of the course already. So again, like, this is like really the time to kind of just like do your best in terms of like getting prepared for that second exam. If you're really looking to knock it out of the park, or if you're doing well already, just keep doing what you're doing. But I know there's some people in here that want to kind of move up the class grade ladder, as it were. So this is an opportunity. I hope you will take it, and you can do really well on the second exam and really make a big, strong comeback, and then lay the groundwork for a strong finish for the course. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's all right in front of you. So take it. Also, as I mentioned, Chapter 6 and 7's mini papers won't be due till the end of spring break, so you'll have an opportunity to even knock out the entire paper if you haven't even started yet, because you can do those 2, and then you can do some other open chapter mini paper. And I'll also open up Chapter 8, but that won't be due till after we finish the exam. So you'll have time to write that one. But we're like, even though semesters are long, like it does kind of ultimately kind of start snowballing to the end. So like once spring break is done, like you'll notice like time will feel like it's speeding up in terms of all your classes and things that are coming due and stuff. So again, like really, really like put your mind now into like what this next like 2 months has in store for you, and try to lay out like a nice, comfortable plan for yourself so that you don't get put in a situation where you don't have enough time to really handle everything, because that's basically the big component to why people don't do well in college, and really ultimately in life. It's like they just aren't like managing their time properly. They're just not planning out like, okay, I've got serious time constraints on top of like needs as a human being that need to be met, and like trying to balance all that. And just people kind of just let the satisfaction of their own desires and instincts kind of be the dominant guiding force, which is fun and nice in the Stone Age, but we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a very structured world, and we have to kind of, if we want to do anything within it that's going to be of any value and ultimately put us in a position where we can be comfortable within it, you have to kind of submit to it as much as possible, and do your best within the limitations that are set forth for us. So it is what it is. We all have to deal with it. For some of us, it's better than others, and the more effort you put in here, the more comfortable it will be for you in the long run. So it is really worth it to you for you to like make the best of this situation. So make sure you do that. All right. So I think that basically covers what's going on with the class. Any questions now you want me to address? Yeah.
The open chapter mini paper already
Available? Yeah. Indeed. It already has a due date too, so make sure that you're aware of that. Other questions? All right, then let's jump in here. So again, we're gonna talk about perfect competition today, but first we're gonna cap off Chapter 7 with just a brief sort of introduction to like these 4 different settings that we're going to study. So perfect competition, in markets characterized by perfect competition, there's going to be many firms. So there's just a ton of firms operating in these markets. each of which is small relative to the entire market. So no firm has any kind of real power in that industry. They all kind of have to submit to the prices that are being set. They're all price takers, as well as the consumers. Consumers are price takers as well. The firms have access to the same technologies and produce similar products. So there's no like innovative way of producing that will like kind of change the cost structure to a firm. Everybody kind of uses the same things to produce. It's not difficult to attain the productive inputs. The knowledge, the skills, the human capital is available as well. And what is being produced is usually something that's very generic. Like agricultural products like oranges. Oranges are oranges. You can't do anything with oranges. Wheat, oil, things of that sort. Iron ore, steel. A lot of what we call the commodities, like these sort of general inputs into other things. Those things are generally going to be dealt with in perfectly competitive markets. The money market is a perfectly competitive market. If you remember your macro course when you study the liquidity preference model, where you have the money supply, money demand, like that is considered a perfectly competitive market as well. There's a lot of examples of like perfectly competitive markets. They're not the dominant markets that exist where most firms operate. We'll talk about that kind of market in a second. Firms in perfectly competitive markets do not have market power. They do not have the ability to charge above their marginal costs. We talked about in Chapter 7 the Lerner Index and its relationship to the markup being the sort of the factor of proportionality that a firm multiplies their marginal cost against to get their price. So how big that is represents how much market power they have. In the case of perfect competition, the Lerner Index is equal to 0, so you have therefore the markup equal to 1, meaning that the firm charges, the price they charge is equal to their marginal cost, Gesundheit. Both the concentration ratios and the Rothschild indexes tend to be close to 0. So remember concentration ratios, we have the C4 ratio, which is like the market shares of the 4 largest firms. The 4 largest firms tend to be really small in perfectly competitive markets, and so then that number tends to be really small, close to 0. We had the the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is the sum of the squared market shares of all the firms that operate a market times 10,000, and that number tends to be really small as well because again, the firms don't have a lot of market share, and so you get really small numbers. You square those, you add them, you get a small number. And then the Rothschild index was the ratio of the elasticity of the industry to the elasticity of the individual firms. So when you have a lot of firms competing, then you're going to have nearly perfectly elastic markets or even perfectly elastic markets, which is what we assume for perfect competition, where the sensitivity of consumers to changes in prices is as much as it can be, and so everybody has to charge the same price. If they don't, quantity demanded goes down to 0. So you have basically a number that represents the elasticity of the entire industry divided by the elasticity of the individual firm, which is close to 0, if not 0, which means that the elasticity of the individual firm will be enormous. Infinite. Perfectly elastic firms have infinite elasticities or close to it, and so you're dividing a number by a super large number that's going to get you close to 0 as far as the Rothschild index. All right, so that's perfect competition. So perfect competition is one end of the competitive spectrum, and we have a very specific model for that. The other end being the monopoly situation, where there's only one firm and that dominates the industry. It, in fact, defines the industry. So a monopoly is a firm that is a sole provider of a good or service in the relevant market. There's a tendency for the seller to capitalize on the monopoly position by restricting output and charging a price above marginal cost. So, I mean, they're able to do it, so they do it. You see it a lot in pharmaceutical industries. The one good thing that's being talked about with this new administration is that they're going to try to get drug prices down, which, again, reflect the fact that a lot of these firms have monopolies over the individual drugs they develop. Nobody else can develop them. Nobody can compete against them. And so they're able to charge any price they want, and they do. They charge ridiculous markups, hundreds of percents above their marginal costs. And so, ideally that will be curtailed by this administration. We'll see. It's a promise that they probably won't keep, but we can be hopeful. All right. So in monopoly markets, there's extreme concentration, meaning that the market share is basically just all held within one firm, and so the C4 and the HHI. Well, the C4 tends to be close to 1, and the HHI tends to be close to the highest number possible. And then the Rothschild index is unity, meaning it's equal to 1, meaning that the elasticity of the industry is equal to the elasticity of the individual firm, because again, there's only one firm, and that defines the industry, so they will have the same elasticity. So that's why the Rothschild index will have that measure. All right, monopolistic competition is sort of a hybrid between monopoly and perfect competition. It's a competitive industry. There's a lot of competition within those types of industries, but each one tends to have some market power. So in a market characterized by monopolistic competition, there are many firms and consumers, just as in perfect competition. Concentration measures are close to 0. Again, the market shares are small within the overall industry. Unlike in perfect competition, each firm produces a product that is slightly different from the products produced by other firms. So Rothschild indexes are greater than 0. So again, like the elasticity of the individual firms is going to be high, but not as high as perfectly elastic industries, because there's going to be less substitutes for the goods. So in these markets, the firms produce slightly different versions of what everybody else produces. So if you imagine like the burger market, right? McDonald's makes Big Macs, and Burger King makes Whoppers. There's bread, meat, tomato, lettuce, mayo. It's basically the exact same thing, but McDonald's is able to brand theirs slightly differently, call it the Big Mac, and because of that, it kind of differentiates it from all other burgers. By doing that, it's able to then create kind of its own little sub-market, which allows it to have some market power over burgers, and therefore be able to charge a bit above its marginal cost. And therefore, when you think about the Whopper, like you might think of it as a substitute, but also you may not think of it as a substitute if you are like loyal to the McDonald's brand, and are a McDonald's person versus a Burger King person. In that case, your demand for the Big Mac will be less elastic than just for burgers in general. So therefore, the Rothschild index will have the industry elasticity divided by the individual firm elasticity being a little bit higher than you would get in a perfectly competitive industry. I'm sorry, a little bit lower than you would get in a perfectly competitive industry, which would result in a slightly bigger Rothschild index. The firm has some control over the price charged for the product. Again, like they have some market power. It's not a lot, but it's enough where it's worth it to firms, especially big scale firms. Firms in monopolistically competitive industries often spend considerable sums on advertising in an attempt to convince consumers that their brands are better than other brands. So advertising does tend to factor in as far as like their costs go in order to be able to be successful within those industries. And then finally is the most common market setting for firms. It is the oligopoly setting. In an oligopolistic market, a few large firms tend to dominate the market. So you're going to have, maybe the number, it can vary, but it's roughly like 2 to 8 in general, but it can vary, of course. And in those markets, you tend to have a lot like large firms competing against each other, but together dominating the industry, kind of like a monopoly. And that is where the complexity and the challenge comes in for some of these firms, because they could work together and operate like a monopoly, get monopoly profits, which is the most profits firms can get in industries. But it's illegal for them to do that in the United States and most Western countries, for them to like collude together, work together to set prices in the way they want. and so therefore there's a degree of risk to firms that want to do it, but there are ways of sort of like kind of maneuvering through that complexity, and we have a couple of different models to kind of highlight the nature of those ways and just basically the nature of the challenge in general. And therefore this market setting is covered in two different chapters, and those are the first two chapters of the third part of the course. um, the first one dealing, chapter 9 dealing with game theory, and chapter 10 dealing with models of oligopolistic markets. Um, so it's complicated enough and common enough that it requires more insights and more analysis, different ways of approaching it, in order to try to optimize it. We haven't perfected it yet because it is complicated, because it has a lot to do with like how much a firm is aware of what their rivals are going to be doing, because they have to take into consideration what their rivals are doing, not just what they are doing, in terms of like their own production choices and their cost structures. So it's more complicated, and it's obviously like more common in the world, because that's the type of industry that most of these large firms operate in, that we buy things from. And so it requires more insights, and therefore it will be a little bit more challenging for you to learn them. And therefore, that's why I don't make the final cumulative, because the last part of the course is challenging in and of itself. So I just kind of leave it on its own, because if you have cumulative finals, people are like scurrying to learn a bunch of stuff from prior in the semester, and then you don't learn the stuff at the end of the semester, which then hurts your overall understanding of what we're trying to do here. So keep that in mind, that even though the final's not cumulative, the last part of the course can be challenging. So don't underestimate it. And again, we're going to be dealing with oligopolistic markets. So in these markets, firms in highly concentrated industries such as the airline, automobile, and aerospace industries operate in oligopolistic markets. The distinguishing feature of an oligopolistic market is mutual interdependence amongst firms in the industry. Like I said, they don't just take into consideration what they're doing. They have to take into consideration what their rivals are doing, because their rivals are limited, and they, with their rivals, define the market. And so they need to be very closely in tune with what their rivals are doing in order to understand what they should do in order to maximize their profits. All right, so those are the four settings we're going to be considering moving forward. And then chapter 10, so that's chapter 9 and 10, that's just the last part of the course. And then chapter 11 deals with strategies that firms with market power can use to sort of maximize their profits. And then chapter 12 deals with information, issues of information. When there's lack of information, what kind of situations might arise as a result of taking the approach of kind of calculating probabilities of things happening. So lots of sort of ancillary important issues covered towards the end that kind of relate to the behavior of the firms that we're going to be talking about post the competitive setting. So the competitive setting is the first one, perfect competition. So that's what we'll start covering today, and we'll finish it off on Thursday. And again, we'll start on Monopoly on Thursday. All right, so the key conditions for perfect competition are as follows. There are many sellers and buyers in the market, each of which is small relative to the market, as I already mentioned. So everybody's kind of selling the same thing. Nobody can make their special branded version of like oil. It's just like, and I'm not talking about like gasoline. I'm talking about oil, like the raw material that we mine out of the earth. So yeah, the firms all have to sell the exact same thing, and there's so many firms in the industry because everybody can sell the same thing. And the thing that determines whether or not firms are going to exist in the industry or not is whether there are profits to be made. And when we're talking about profits, we're talking about economic profits. So. Of course, yeah, that's totally possible. Yeah, that's a big process, and it would be challenging, but yeah, it's definitely possible. Each firm in the market produces a homogeneous, identical product, as I already mentioned. So consumers view the products of all firms in the market as perfect substitutes. So therefore, the elasticity is as much as it can be, which is infinite is what we assume. Um, Buyers and sellers have perfect information, so all the information necessary to make the right decisions about buying with respect to quality, with respect to the price of other firms selling the good is available to everybody. Sellers know what their rivals are doing. They know exactly what they're charging. Everybody has all the information they need to make the best decisions they possibly can make given the nature of the context that they are operating in. There's no transaction costs, so all the transaction costs we talked about in chapter 6, they don't exist here. It's really simple to just buy a good without having to make a specialized investment that leads to a relationship-specific exchange, such as site specificity or dedicated assets or human capital, etc. There's free entry and exit into the market, so there aren't barriers to entry. Firms can enter and exit the market in the long run, which implies that firms operating in a perfectly competitive market earn zero economic profits. So there aren't things that stop firms from entering. And the only thing that stops a firm from exiting is the fact that they might be in the short run. They might be locked into a certain amount of capital that they're using, like maybe a lease on their equipment or maybe like a loan that they're paying on like their equipment, things of that sort. So in the short run, the short run is what it is. Folks are locked into their amount of capital. But if there are no economic profits to be made, and in fact firms are making a loss in these industries, then in the long run they will exit. If there are economic profits being made in these industries, then firms in the long run will enter the industry. And when firms enter the industry, supply increases, which lowers the equilibrium price. When that happens, then the price tends to erode any profits that exist, ultimately leading the firms to make what we call zero economic profits. But when we're talking about profits, of course, we're talking about revenues minus opportunity costs, and so the implicit costs are still being being covered, like meaning the opportunity cost of the investment is being covered, right? So the next best alternative of just the funds that are being used to fund production, such as like just investing in regular bonds that can get you like just a basic return on the market, that is being covered when we say that firms are making zero economic profit. All right, demand at the market and the firm level. So in a competitive market, price is determined by the intersection of the market supply and demand curve. So that market model that we studied early on in the course, that you studied in your microeconomics courses, and also at the beginning of your macro courses, is a model of a perfectly competitive market. But we didn't think about like what the individual firms deal with in those markets. We just looked at like, the intersection of the demand and the supply and kind of what that implied about the price, the quantity, consumer surplus, etc., producer surplus. So now we'll consider what happens to the firm, individual firms in these markets. So again, you have a downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. That's going to establish an equilibrium quantity for the market and an equilibrium price. So the figure is going to illustrate the distinction between the market demand curve and the demand curve facing a perfectly competitive firm. So although we have this downward sloping demand curve for the entire industry, the individual firm faces a different type of demand curve. So again, the market itself sets an equilibrium price, and no individual firm has any ability to affect that price. All the individual firms are price takers. So again, they have to sell at that price. They cannot sell at another price, and therefore the demand curve that the individual perfectly competitive firm faces is going to be just a horizontal line at the equilibrium price that the market is setting. So that will be the demand that the individual firm faces, and it is perfectly elastic. So again, elasticity is the percent change in quantity demanded, the percent change in price. If price changes by even just a penny, quantity demanded goes down to zero, is just the nature of that demand. And again, it has to do with the fact that everybody's selling the same thing. All the goods being sold are perfect substitutes. and so nobody has any kind of advantage whatsoever in those markets. From the individual firm's point of view, the firm can sell as much as it wishes at the price, at the equilibrium price. All right, now let's look at short-run output decisions for these firms. Like, how do they choose how much to sell in these markets? Well, it has everything to do with comparing their costs to the benefits of selling in a perfectly competitive market. So the costs that we talked about, in Chapter 5 are going to be relevant here. And the fact that the firm faces a perfectly competitive demand firm will also, perfectly elastic demand curve will also be relevant here. All right, so as we know, firms are always looking to maximize their profits. That means that they're trying to minimize their costs and maximize their revenue so they can maximize their profits. Here's the revenue curve for a perfectly competitive market. So on the y-axis is revenue, and on the x-axis is the amount of output the firm produces. If we let Q represent the output of the firm, so Q is the amount on the x-axis, the total revenue to the firm of producing Q units is going to equal the quantity of the good that's being sold times the price it can be sold at, which will equal their revenue. So revenues will increase at a constant rate here because the price doesn't change. So the price is essentially the slope of this line, which is the revenue line, and we know that the slope of any curve is going to be its marginal something. So if this is our revenue curve, then the slope of this line is the marginal revenue, the extra revenue a firm can get by selling additional units. I'll talk more about that in a second. Since each unit of the output can be sold at the market price P, each unit adds exactly P dollars to revenue. So the extra revenue that a firm can gain is going to be from additional units produced and sold is going to be the amount that they get from selling it, which is the price that is constant, that they cannot change, regardless of how much they sell. So there's a linear relation between revenues and output of a competitive firm, as we see here. This is what the revenue curve looks like. It will look differently for other firms that operate in more less competitive markets. So again, marginal revenue is the change in revenue attributable to the last unit of output sold. Geometrically, it is the slope of the revenue curve, right? So the change in X over the change in Y. So you change X by 1 unit, and revenue is going to change by the price that 1 unit is sold at. So therefore, the marginal revenue will be equal to price for these firms. In economic terms, the marginal revenue for a competitive firm is the market price. In mathematical terms, marginal revenue, MR, is the derivative of the revenue curve. So this is our general relation between revenue and quantity. It's basically, again, denoting the fact that revenue is a function of quantity. So the derivative of this with respect to quantity, so the change in revenue with respect to the change in quantity is our marginal revenue, which is the slope of this revenue line, which is going to equal price for the perfectly competitive firm. So that gets us to this principle for competitive firms' demand. The demand curve for a competitive firm's product is a horizontal line at the market price. The price is a competitive firm's marginal revenue. All right. So again, the demand for the individual firm in a perfectly competitive market is equal to the price. It's that line at the market price, and that is also equal to the marginal revenue of the firm. Which means that the demand that the firm faces is also their marginal revenue curve. So for a perfectly competitive firm, revenue is, again, equal to price times quantity, where P is the market equilibrium price. Thus, the derivative of this with respect to quantity, right? You just take the derivative. That means you have that exponent 1, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from that. You're left with Q raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1. So you're left with P. That's our marginal revenue. Is equal to price. All right, now let's throw in the cost function. So again, this is your standard cost function. We see that the marginal cost, the slope of our cost function changes along it, again, reflecting the basic assumptions we made about general production processes, where you're going to have increasing returns to labor initially, which will cause marginal costs to decrease, and then once the firm hits that decreasing returns to labor range, because again, workers are limited by the amount of capital they have. They don't have enough factory space to go around. They don't have enough machines to work. As the firm increases their scale of operation by, in the short run, only being able to hire more people to do so, then they hit that short run wall, decreasing returns to scale, which causes marginal costs to then start to increase. So that's what we're seeing as far as what's happening with our cost curve. The profits of a perfectly competitive firm are the difference between revenues and costs. So profit is represented by pi in this course in economics in general. And so profits are the difference between the revenues gained by selling a certain quantity of output, so the price times quantity, minus the cost of producing that quantity of output. So here we see that cost is above revenue, so obviously it's not profitable to operate in this range. Here it is profitable because, again, revenue is above cost, so that therefore profits will be positive. But beyond that point, due to the decreasing returns to labor, the cost curve becomes larger than the revenue curve, which represents the fact that the firm would be operating at a loss there as well. So really, this is only the relevant range of production that the firm needs to consider. Geometrically, profits are given by the vertical distance between the cost function, labeled CQ, and the revenue line. The profit maximizing level of output is going to be the level at which the vertical distance between the revenue line and the cost curve is at its greatest. So it's going to be somewhere around here where these curves are furthest apart. In this case, it's going to happen at this point here. So Q star represents the amount of output that will maximize the firm's profits. It happens that at that point, the slope of the cost curve is exactly equal to the slope of the revenue line. So at that point where profits are at their maximum, that amount of output that represents the profit maximizing output, that represents the points where the cost curves have equivalent slopes, which means that the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained by selling additional units, is equal to the marginal cost, the extra cost incurred by producing an additional unit. So recall that the slope of the cost curve is the marginal cost. So that's just our general, again, specification of the cost curve. And marginal cost is the derivative of our cost curve with respect to quantity. So the profit maximizing output is the output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Since marginal revenue is equal to the market price for a perfectly competitive firm, the manager must equate the market price to marginal cost to maximize profits in perfectly competitive industries. So that is the rule of thumb for firms that operate in these industries, to set their price equal to marginal costs in order to figure out how much they should produce. And again, that has a lot to do with their own cost structure. Marginal cost is a reflection of their cost structure. So it's going to differ across firms potentially, but as we said, most firms have similar cost structures in perfectly competitive firms. And so ultimately, there isn't going to be that much variation there. So marginal cost equals marginal revenue. The derivative of the marginal cost of the cost function equals the derivative of the revenue curve at the profit maximizing level of output, which equals price. All right, so an alternative way to express a competitive output rule can be depicted with standard, average, and marginal cost curves. So here we have our marginal cost curve, again representing the fact that initially there are decreasing returns there are increasing returns to our productive input which is labor, because initially there is that specialization benefit that the firms gain from hiring additional people, dividing up the tasks, working more efficiently. But at the minimum of the marginal cost curve, that's where the change happens. That's where the firm hits that uh, short run wall, and the decreasing returns start to bring up marginal costs. Here's our average total cost curve, again U-shaped, because initially the not only are the increasing returns to our labor input pulling down average total cost, but also the spreading effect from the fixed costs is also pulling down average total cost. Remember, there's a fixed cost to the fixed input that again reflects the fact that the firm is in the short run, and as they increase the amount of output, their average fixed cost, which is a number that doesn't change, divided by a number that gets bigger and bigger, the quantity of output, fixed cost divided by quantity, that number just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's a big component of average total cost being the sum of average fixed cost plus average variable cost. And so as the firm becomes bigger and bigger, sells more output, that spreading effect of the fixed cost is pulling down the average total cost, along with the fact that there are initially increasing returns to labor. But once that changes and decreasing returns start to bring up marginal costs, then that starts to have that countervailing effect on average total cost, where the average variable costs are trying to pull up average total cost, but the spreading effect of average fixed cost is still bringing it down, which is why we still see average total cost decreasing over a range that changes when marginal cost crosses it. That's the point where the decreasing returns to the labor start to become the dominant force on average total cost, bringing up average total costs. So an alternative way to express the competitive output rule can be depicted with standard, average, and marginal cost curves. So now we're going to throw into this framework the demand curve that the firm faces. Again, it happens at the market price in the competitive market. So that is the demand curve for the individual firm. And it's also their marginal revenue curve, because price equals marginal revenue, because, again, marginal revenue is constant, and it is simply the price that they are able to charge on each additional unit. That's the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units. So here is the demand curve. Again, equal to price, equal to marginal revenue. If the market price is equal to this competitive price, this price intersects the marginal cost curve at an output Q star. So this is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And therefore, that is, as we already noted, going to be the point at which the firm is going to maximize their profits by producing the output that equates marginal revenue with marginal cost. So that is the point. That point happens here. Anywhere before that, you see marginal revenue. Well, it has to happen over the increasing range of marginal cost, because we could potentially, well, this marginal cost does go up here. And so obviously you're going to have another point where marginal cost and marginal revenue are going to meet, but that's going to be over the range where marginal cost is decreasing. So it does make sense to continue producing past that point. So along this range here, the additional revenue gained from producing additional units is greater than the additional cost incurred by producing additional units, up until this point where they're equivalent. And then at this point, the additional cost of selling additional units, the marginal cost, will exceed the extra revenue gained from selling additional units, the marginal revenue, and therefore it doesn't make sense for the firm to produce more than that. So again, this is the profit maximizing level of output, Q star. Any questions so far? All right. The shaded triangle here represents the profits of the firm. So at that profit maximizing level of output, once having been established by the firm, they now consider, well, what are my profits at that point? Well, it's going to be the difference between what they can charge and their average cost of producing times the amount produced. And that's where the average total cost curve comes into play. So once the Profit maximizing level of output has been chosen. The firm then has to say, well, how much does it cost me on average to produce at that level? Well, it's going to be this much here. So average total cost at Q star. So that's the average cost of producing. This is at that level, this is the amount that they're able to generate by selling units at that level, the equilibrium price in the market. And so the difference between the two represents profits for that one unit. Multiply that by every unit being sold, and that gets you the profit, which geometrically is this rectangle on the curve that we're on the graph that we're looking at. So graphically, that represents our profits there for the perfectly competitive firm. The area of the shaded rectangle is given by the base, which is Q star, times the height, which is the difference between, again, the competitive price minus the average total cost of producing the optimal quantity Q star, the amount that's going to maximize profits for the firm. Base Q times the height. Recall that the average total cost is equal to our total cost of producing at any given amount divided by the quantity that's being produced at that amount. So that's the average total cost there. The area of the shaded triangle is equal to, again, the difference between the price and the average total cost times the quantity. So the height of this rectangle times the quantity. If we just multiply this out here, you get Q times P, which is revenue at the optimal profit maximizing level of output, minus, so the Q's cancel out here, minus the cost of producing at that level of output. So again, that's what we're capturing by that graphical representation of profits. Getting us to the principle, the competitive output rule. To maximize profits, a perfectly competitive firm produces the output at which price equals marginal cost in the range over which marginal cost is increasing. So I'm saying this the same thing over and over, really, in different ways. But, I'm just trying to drive home a very important point that I hope will be at least permanently stored in your head for a few weeks. Yeah. No, because this isn't C times Q. This is C of Q. Yeah. So it's just a general way of stating the cost function. Other questions? Alrighty. All right. So again, it is so it's the point where price equals marginal cost. That's the competitive output rule. Mathematically, the profits of a perfectly competitive firm are, of course, equal to price times quantity minus the cost of producing at any given quantity. The first order condition, meaning the derivative of the profits for maximizing profits, requires that the marginal profits be equal to zero. So remember, you want to maximize any relationship in math. You take the derivative, you set equal to zero. If it has a maximum, you're going to get it that way. If it has a minimum, you'll get it that way. But obviously, profits have a maximum. They increase and they decrease, as we looked at in the early part of the course. We'll talk about that again later in the course as well. So taking the derivative of this with respect to quantity, that's going to leave us with P minus the derivative of Q of CQ, which is, again, marginal cost. Set that equal to zero. And we can obtain the profit maximizing rule for a firm in perfect competition by just, adding this term to both sides. Again, getting us to the point where we are at the optimal output rule for the firm. How they maximize their profits is by setting price equal to marginal cost. So just different ways of getting to the same conclusion based on, all the characteristics of the model. We can do it in different ways. We can do it graphically a couple of different ways. We can do it mathematically, of course, ultimately, which is most important because that's where the more complicated cases will lie and more, in more complex mathematical relationships. So again, this tells us that price equals marginal cost. demonstration problem. So a little bit more practical. The cost function for a firm is going to be given by CQ equals 5 plus Q squared. What does Q squared represent here? Our variable cost, yes. It represents our variable cost. What does the 5 represent? Fixed cost, right? Because cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost in the short run, which we always assume the firm to be in some short run situation where they have locked themselves into some level of capital. If the firm sells output in a perfectly competitive market and other firms in the industry sell output at a price of $20, what price should the manager of this firm put on the product? What price should this firm put on their product in this perfectly competitive market? $20, right? They have to sell at the price that everybody else is selling at. They can't do anything other than that. They're not going to sell at a higher. If they try to sell at a higher price, they're going to be priced out of the market. If they sell at a lower price, they're just kind of shooting themselves in the foot because they could be making more. And so they're going to charge what everybody else is charging. What level of output should be produced to maximize profit? So that's the thing we'll figure out, and then how much profit will be earned. So again, we figured out this one already. The first part, they have to charge $20 because it's a perfectly competitive market. All right, so now let's figure out what level of output should be produced to maximize profits. What is the marginal cost equation? 2Q, right? It's just a derivative of our cost equation. What is the marginal revenue? It's $20. Marginal revenue equals price for a perfectly competitive firm. So everybody's selling at $20, that's their marginal revenue. So we have to set price equal to marginal cost, which is essentially setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which is just the general sort of condition they're trying to meet. But in a perfectly competitive market, marginal revenue equals price. So they set price equal to marginal cost. So again, the marginal cost is equal to 2Q. Our marginal revenue is our price, which is equal to 20. And so now we have to just solve for Q, which is simple, obviously. Divide both sides by 2. And we get the optimal quantity, the profit maximizing level of output for this firm to be 10 units. Yeah.
Like competitive markets, everyone's charge the same price. What if their costs are significantly different?
Well, they wouldn't be significantly different because in the long run, if there are any opportunities for firms to have profits, they become eroded because firms enter the market. So ultimately, all the firms will have very similar cost structures. Like they will have very similar means of producing, and they will all be the same size essentially. That's the only way they'll be able to thrive in those markets. And so that's ultimately like the steady state of the market, like what it winds up becoming and what they wind up being in the world that we exist in. So.
Commodity is being sold in like the middle of the United States. There's a company that's 50 miles away, and there's a company that's West Coast, East Coast. So it's much cheaper costs are a lot cheaper for the company that's a couple miles away.
Then the company that has the higher cost structure will be priced out of the market, and then only the companies in those West Coast production facilities will be able to thrive and survive. It's perfectly competitive, and that's what it means essentially. Yeah.
So for you said T equals MC.
Price equals marginal cost. You got it? Okay. All right. How much profit will be earned? So what is profit again? What's the equation for profit? Which is revenue minus cost, right? Yeah. All right. So here's our profit equation. Again, we are considering our profits at the profit maximizing level, which is where that star comes from. So Q is equal to 10, P is equal to 20, right? So we just need the cost of producing 10 units, right? So we have to plug that into our cost function to get that total cost of production. So 10 times 20 there, obviously 200. And we're subtracting the cost of producing. So be careful. Sometimes people will subtract 5, but then they'll add q squared, which will, get you the wrong answer. Just be careful there. So anyway, minus 5 minus 10 squared. So that's minus 5 minus 100. So that's 200 minus 100. That's going to give you 100 minus 5 is 95. So profits are equal to $95 in this industry. There are profits being made in this industry, and therefore, in the long run, firms will enter the industry and they will take out those profits. They will add to the supply in the industry. Supply will shift. That'll lower the price. That will erode profits down to zero.
95 would be their just like financial profits, not.
No, it's their profits.
That's their economic.
That's their economic profit. Yeah.
So where in that equation do we call it? That cost equation, I guess, also includes implicit costs.
Yeah, it does. Right. When we're considering the cost of capital, we're considering the implicit cost of what could have been spent on other things. All right, so let's talk about minimizing losses, which will then get us to the insights we need to understand the supply decision, ultimately the supply curve for an individual firm. So what are the conditions that make a firm either stay in business or not stay in business in these perfectly competitive industries? Sometimes they can't operate at a loss, meaning that they're locked into some amount of capital. And so they have to kind of remain within the industry, but certain conditions will imply that they should shut down operations versus not shut down operations under those circumstances, and that's what we'll consider here. So in some instances, short-run losses are going to be inevitable. Here we analyze procedures for minimizing losses in the short run. If losses are sustained in the long run, the best thing for the firm to do is to exit the industry. So let's talk about the short run operating losses. Consider first a situation where there are some fixed costs of production, which means that we're going to get a U-shaped average total cost curve. Suppose the market price, PE in this case, lies below the average total cost curve. So here's our profit maximizing level of output, Q star. At that level, the average cost of producing is above the price, and therefore the amount you're going to gain from selling is going to be less than what it costs you on average to produce at that level. And then here's our average variable cost curve, which we didn't see in the prior graph that had the cost curves in it. Again, U-shaped, reflecting the fact that there are increasing returns initially, then decreasing returns to our input, labor. And where the change happens is where marginal cost goes up, even after decreasing returns start to bring up marginal cost. Because the average is still above the marginal. Because marginal is still below the average. This is the other way to look at it, which is the right way. Then it's, even though marginal is increasing, it's still bringing down the average variable cost up until a point where they cross, which is going to happen at the minimum of the average variable cost, and that's where, again, the decreasing returns starts to pull up average variable costs. But that happens before the minimum of the average total cost curve, because again, average total cost curve is also being acted upon by the spreading effect of the average fixed cost, which past this point is still the dominant force up until the point where marginal cost crosses, which is the point where decreasing returns to labor becomes dominant, brings up average total cost. All right, so there's our relevant cost curves. There's our marginal revenue, and again, our marginal revenue is our demand curve for the perfectly competitive firm, and that is, in this scenario, below the average total cost. So suppose the market price lies below the average total cost curve, but above the average variable cost curve, as we see here. So here is our revenues. Geometrically, this is how much the firm is earning by selling, their price times their quantity. At that level of output, the profit maximizing level of output, here's our average total cost of producing. If the firm produces output Q star, where price equals marginal cost, a loss of the shaded area will result. So for each unit produced, they're going to cover this much of the cost of production, and there's going to be this much not being covered times the amount that's being sold. So this represents a loss. The total cost of producing is the average total cost at any given level times the quantity. So the rectangle made up by the revenue and the loss, it represents the cost of producing, which obviously exceeds the revenues, and therefore the difference between those two shaded areas, this light blue rectangle, is the loss. At this quantity, price exceeds the average variable cost curve. So at this quantity, that does represent a point of loss for the firm where they're not making economic profits, they are making negative economic profits. The average cost of producing attributable to their variable cost, the labor that they're using, is below the price. Here's our variable costs at that level of production. You've got, again, the cost of producing attributable to labor at that level times the quantity. So this red rectangle represents the cost of labor to produce that profit maximizing level of output. What is the difference between average total cost and average variable cost? Average fixed cost, right? So therefore, the distance between this point and this point represents the average fixed cost, the average amount of costs attributable to the fixed input into production for producing this one unit, multiply it by Q. That means the sum of this rectangle and this green rectangle represents the fixed cost of producing. We see that part of those fixed costs are being covered by the revenue that the firm is earning in the market. So even though they're operating at a loss, some of their fixed costs are being covered by the amount they're earning. Certainly all of their variable costs are, and there's some left over, fortunately. So even though it is incurring losses, the firm should continue to produce in the short run because they are at least covering some of their fixed costs. The firm has fixed costs that would have to be paid even if the firm decided to shut down its operation. So this amount is something that they have to pay no matter what. They have to pay it. It's their fixed costs until they're in the long run and they can get out of their contracts, whatever. They have to pay that amount of money. So the firm would not earn zero economic profits if it's shut down, but would instead operate at a loss. If it's shut down at this level, then they would have to pay for the fixed costs, which is a greater amount than the loss that they are facing just by operating in the market. And therefore, under this situation, because even though the average total cost is above the price, because the price is above the average variable cost curve, it makes sense for the firm to continue operating in the short run. It makes sense for the firm to continue operating at a loss because it's better than not operating, which would incur a greater loss, which is their total fixed cost. If they're operating, then their revenues cover part of their fixed costs plus their variable costs, right? So it makes sense for them to operate at a loss given this kind of situation. And again, this could happen very easily for a firm that's like operating and maybe like there is some variation in cost structure. And so some firms have a little bit more of an advantage. But they can charge a different price. It just means that they have a different scale of operation. And then let's say, the supply curve, the upward sloping supply curve shifts to the right. That lowers the price, and then that could lower the price to the point where the firm would be in this situation and therefore would have to make this decision. And this is the right decision for the firm, given this particular set of circumstances. Again, with the price, the marginal revenue curve, the demand curve being below the average total cost curve, but above the average variable cost curve. All right, now let's look at a situation where they would shut down. So suppose the market price is so low that it lies below the average variable cost curve. So in this case, we have an average variable cost that is going to be above the price, and therefore average total cost is up here somewhere. So here again are our revenues, the price times quantity. If the firm produced the profit maximizing level of output, which again happens at the point where marginal cost equals price, which equals marginal revenue, in the range of increasing marginal costs, which we know is the range over which they would operate, it would incur a loss equal to the sum of the two shaded triangles if they continued operating. In this case, here's our average total cost curve. Here's the average total cost of producing. Here's our average variable cost of producing, the profit maximizing level of output. Therefore, that represents the average fixed cost times the quantity. This is the fixed cost here. This point represents the average variable cost of producing times the quantity. So the variable costs are both this green box of revenue and this dark blue box. So again, this is the fixed cost, and that is the variable cost. So in this case, we see that, of course, again, the firm is operating at a loss, right? There's a difference between how much they're gaining per unit and how much it costs them on average to produce per unit. So this is the loss. These two boxes, these two blue boxes represent the loss for the firm. So this is the kind of loss they would incur if they did operate, meaning that their revenues aren't even enough to cover their labor, their wages, right? So by operating out of pocket, they have to pay for their wages as well. And so therefore, under this condition, this set of circumstances where the average variable cost curve is also above the price, the firm should shut down. Because if it did shut down, then it wouldn't incur this huge loss. It would incur just the fixed cost loss. So suppose instead of producing Q star units of output, the firm decided to shut down its operation. Its losses would equal its fixed costs that must be paid even if no output is produced. So that would be the loss that they would incur, which is, again, is less than the loss if they were to produce, which is equal to both boxes there. So to summarize, we have demonstrated the following principle. The short-run output decision under perfect competition. To maximize short-run profits, a perfectly competitive firm should produce in the range of increasing marginal costs where price equals marginal costs, provided that price is greater than or equal to the average variable cost. If price is less than average variable cost, the firm should shut down its plant to minimize its losses. Are there any questions about this? All right, so this condition will allow us then to establish what the individual firm's supply curve will look like, and then be able to aggregate that, combine it across all firms to get to the market supply curve that we all are familiar with from Chapter 3 and our other classes. Anyway, that is the end of the material for today. So good job. I hope you have a good day, and I hope you have a good couple of days, and I will see you on Thursday.